Hi, quick revision video on Immanuel Kant. Disclaimer, I'm not the expert that Dr. Romero is. She has a PhD in this stuff. I don't, but I have done a fair bit of reading in English, not in German, on him and by him. So, if she says things that contradict what I say, listen to her, but otherwise, hopefully this will be useful. Let's think then about the basis for his ethics. Let's think about the fact that it's grounded in reason, but a very particular kind of reason. So for Kant, there's pure reason, which is essentially a priori. There's practical reason, which is essentially a posteriori. But there's this special category of pure practical reason, or rather the a priori synthetic. Now, the difference for Kant between analytic and synthetic is that in an analytic statement, the predicate is contained within the subject concept. So, if you consider the proposition a triangle has three sides, then it's within the concept of a triangle that it has three sides. Three sides is the thing that you're predicating, that you're saying about the triangle, but it's already contained within the concept of the triangle. Whereas in the statement, a triangle has a right angle, it is not within the concept of a triangle that it has a right angle. It is therefore a synthetic statement. Now, most synthetic statements you discover through experience, sense experience, such as this pen is green. The greenness isn't contained within the concept of the pen or the highlighter, but you know it through looking, right? That is where, of course, Kant is very different to A.J. Ayer, who in the 1930s redefined synthetic in purely empirical terms. He essentially wants to destroy Kant's entire basis, and I think it's a dastardly trick of just disagreeing with the definition. But for Kant, he says that there are some things that, although the predicate concept isn't contained within a subject concept, nevertheless you don't need any sense experience to be able to work it out. Now, he uses mathematics as an example. His actual example is 7 plus 5 equals 12, and he says this is because the subject being 12, the concepts of 5 and 7 are not contained in them, or the other way around, and there's a whole thing about mathematical calculation being tautological transformation according to Ayer. So we'll lay aside the maths because I think it's possibly a bad example. But certainly his entire ethical system is based on this idea that to say, for example, lying is wrong is to predicate wrongness or immorality of the subject lying. But you note that it's not a tautology. Wrongness doesn't belong to the concept of lying. However, you don't need to do any lying. You don't have to have any experience of lying to work out that it is wrong. You only need to understand the concepts and, of course, to make recourse to the categorical imperative. But more of that later. So, in terms of morality, well, all questions of morality are the question, what ought or should I do? And do remember that ought implies can. You can't be obliged to do something that's impossible for you to do. Otherwise, where does the obligation come from? It just kind of doesn't make sense. And if you think that this is something that we can object to, well, tell me on what basis I should fly out the window if I can't, it being locked. Then we need to think about the difference between heteronomy and autonomy. Heteronomy, as you know from your Greek homo, meaning same, hetero meaning different, and nomos meaning rules. So heteronomy is ruled by other. Autonomy, auto is self, or auto is self. So that's self-rule. And what's really interesting about Kantian ethics is that he puts the agent at the centre of ethics. There is perhaps a very interesting link there to virtue ethics, because although it is a normative theory, it does tell you what you ought to do in situations, Kant is very, very careful not to tell you any particular commands. So he doesn't say, don't lie, don't steal, don't murder. He says, follow the categorical imperative, you'll be able to work it out for yourself. Now, he so happens to think that that would, of course, lead you to conclude that you shouldn't lie and steal and commit mass murder, or indeed any murder at all. But he's not actually prescribing the actions. That would be heteronymous. No, he just gives you a toolkit and expects you to get on with it. And in that way, you could say that in putting the agent, the moral agent, at the centre of his ethics, it's slightly similar to virtue ethics. But that's slightly an aside. So, his next big metaphysical work, and remember that before he even gets on with the content of his ethical system, he lays the groundwork. He literally writes a whole book called The Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, and only then does he write Metaphysics of Morals. So I would be very wary of saying that Kant doesn't give us any reason or any basis for his ethical framework, his ethical theory. That's a wild assertion. He literally writes a whole book on it. Why we should follow it. Unlike Bentham, who just has this spurious claim that nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to determine what we ought to do, and thereby commits the naturalistic fallacy. That really doesn't give us a decent basis, or it just gives us basically a fallacy. Kant is very careful to give us a basis. So, to return to some of the content of his metaphysics, he is very interested in motive. He asks the question, what is consistently good? And he concludes that the only consistently good thing is the goodwill. Of course, this is completely against what Bentham would say, where for Bentham, it is in fact happiness is always good, or the most happiness, the greatest number, is always good. But of course, even though Bentham is writing after Kant knows that this is absolute cobblers. He says quite clearly that it is impossible for a man to determine with complete certainty what will make him truly happy, because omniscience would be required for that. Supposing that you want health, and that you think that health will bring you happiness, well then, in order to preserve your health, you will never eat chocolate cake, you'll never have jam donuts, or ice cream, you might dedicate far too much time to going to the gym, and then of course when COVID-19 happens, you can't go to the gym, you find yourself being miserable, and you can't get all your healthy snacks, and so you're miserable, etc, etc. So that's a red herring. You might think money will make you happy, but in pursuing money you become a miser, a bit like this girl that I dated for a very, very short time, who I think I've told you about, but essentially used to cycle about 40 minutes every night to buy vegetables for 10 pence, wouldn't ever spend any money on going to the cinema or having a coffee out or anything interesting, and essentially has ended up alone and sad, or so I choose to think. So, if happiness isn't consistently good, what is consistently good? The motive to do what you ought to do, he says, as in to follow your duty. We should, of course, make sure that we understand the distinction between motive and intention, and in this regard I think Bentham is quite helpful. So, for Bentham, motive is essentially the efficient cause. It's what impels us or drives us to do an action. He uses the example of ravishing a virgin and making love to one's wife. And he says, look, both of these things are motivated by sexual desire. And in fact, that shows us, according to Bentham, that motive is ethically neutral, because they would both, the same motive, sexual desire, would lead you to two different actions, one of which, ravishing a virgin, i.e. rape, would be morally bad, and the other is not morally bad. Bentham then says the difference between motive, as we said, the efficient cause, intention is almost like the final cause. It's what you want from of an action. So Bentham again uses the example of pushing someone. You might intend to touch a man, but not to hurt him. So you intend to give your friend a sort of pat on the back or something. Unfortunately, you're too vigorous and they're hurt. And so because, according to Bentham, neither motive nor intention can be measured, he says it's only the outcome that matter. But for Kant, no. Because you can't know what will occur from your action, the consequences don't matter. They do not determine whether the action's good because they are unknown. And also, of course, he recognises that you'd have to go to the end of the universe to know the absolute outcome of your actions. The only thing that you can know for absolute certainty that is good is if you intend to do what you should do. So think about the famous case of the axe murderer, the inquiring axe murderer who comes to your door, where's your mum that I may kill her? Do you lie or do you tell the truth? Now, the instinct to tell the truth from the intention of protecting your mother might have the adverse effect. It might be that you say, oh yes, she's just gone out into the woods for a sojourn to see if the sedge has withered from the lake and no birds sing because she's been reading, some Keats. And the murderer says, well, I absolutely hate Keats. I'm more of a Wordsworth fan myself. I shall go and chop her into small bits. And you are thinking, ha 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 ha. Actually, she's upstairs, really reading Dylan Thomas. But no, she has gone to the woods. You didn't know this. And so, unfortunately, the murderer comes out, he finds your mum, chops her to small bits. You're to blame. You lied, which you shouldn't have done. And as a consequence of your lying, the murderers found her. Now, supposing instead that you tell the truth, and you say, yeah, do you know what? She's on her in her room, I think. She said she was going to go upstairs and watch Netflix. Well, fine. You've told the truth. The fact that the murderer then decides to go and chop her to small bits isn't on you. All you know is that you acted morally. You can't know what other people will do with the decisions that they have to take. And so you should not feel guilty because you cannot be responsible for other people's actions. And in that is actually, I think, quite liberating. Okay, so we've got this idea that we should be acting from our duty. Well, fine. But how do I know what my duty is? Well, in order to do this, he says, sometimes you kind of know. There are some things that you sort of know where your duty is. And there are some things that you just sort of know it's not against the duty. So the question is, when you're not sure where your duty lies, how can you determine what your duty is? Well, we've got two things that could guide us. There's a hypothetical imperative and a categorical imperative. The hypothetical imperative is always of the form if X then Y. So if I want to go to the cinema, then I should leave my house. But this is particular and is always about prudence. It's always concerned with some future end. And as we've already established, future being indeterminate to the end of the universe is not a good basis for ethics. It isn't really what should I do, full stop. It's what would be helpful for some end. So that is prudence and not to be confused with morality. This leaves us only with a categorical imperative, one that commands absolutely for all time, for all situations, everywhere and for everyone. So, how does it work? Well, there are three formulations of the categorical imperative, and it's important to note that this is the same categorical imperative for him. It is said in different ways, and really it's all based on the principle of non-contradiction from Aristotle, because the formulation of universality, which is act always according to that maxim, which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law, tells us that we can only perform those actions which we would be willing everybody essentially to perform. And then essentially there are two red flags for your putative maxim. Putative, remember, is just something that you're putting out there as a maxim. So you're thinking, should I lie to save my own skin? So my maxim would be, when I'm in dire straits, I'll lie to save my own skin. And then you ask yourself, would this create a contradiction in nature, which is to say a logical contradiction, such that by willing it to be done by everybody it couldn't then be done? Or a contradiction in the will, which is, I want P, but then if you are wanting P, then by your willing yourself to do it, you also will everybody else for it, and you probably then are willing against your own future will. I'll explain how that works in a second. So firstly, the contradiction in nature. Now Kant's own example is to make a false promise to return money. So I'm hard up for cash. I ask my friend Sam to borrow a tenner, and I say, look, I promise I'll pay you back tomorrow, but you know full well that you won't be able to pay me back tomorrow. Should I make a false promise? Well, if this were universalised, then I couldn't make a promise, because a promise, by definition, is a contract of trust, and it requires the other person to trust you. But if everybody knows that people who are hard up for cash make these false promises, then of course they're not going to be believed, and so no one could make the promise. You couldn't make the promise by wishing everybody or willing everybody to make such false promises, and so it creates a paradox where you cannot will to do it. So you know it's wrong. The contradiction in the will arises, his example is if you say, I will not help those in need when I'm able. Now that's sort of fine, doesn't create a logical paradox, but by doing that, you're also willing against your own will to be helped in times of need, which would create a paradox in your will. Another way of thinking about this is, if you are trying to make yourself an exception to a rule that you would have everybody else follow, you know you're doing wrong. And there's quite an interesting and subtle link, I think, there to conscience. We could almost say, and it's a bit of an aside with thinking about paper one and conscience, you remember that for Aquinas, conscience is essentially an activity of reason, as a rational activity applying knowledge to a certain situation. And here you could say, well, maybe the categorical imperative is a way in which we see conscience as a rational activity exercising itself, because, as I say, if you are trying to get everybody else to behave differently from how you want to be able to behave, that's the short-tailed sign that you're trying to pass a maxim that is essentially immoral. And that's why it leads quite nicely into this second formulation, and should be why you can see that it is not a separate categorical imperative, it is the same categorical imperative. And so the second formulation, act so that you treat the humanity, whether in your own person or another, never merely as a means but always at the same time as an end. Now the German word Menschlich, humanity, is a metaphysical concept. It is not just treat people, it is the humanity in that person, and you could make a very interesting case for humanity being present in non-human persons if you wanted. You could go down a kind of Singer route here. You could talk about artificial intelligence, whether artificial intelligences have humanity, and so that it could become quite an interesting kind of offshoot. But let's just focus on human beings for the moment. So this does not mean, because of what the caveat is never merely as a means, but always at the same time, simultaneously as an end. So business transactions are absolutely fine. Negotiations are absolutely fine. Obviously you're trying to get as much out of the other person as possible, but they are also trying to do the same to you. So I say, I like to buy a newspaper. They say, give me £5. I say, I think it's a bit steep. I'll give you £2. They say, no, actually the recommended retail price is £2.50. We settle on £2.50. I've used the newsagent for my daily newspaper. The newsagent has used me for source of income. it's mutually agreed on, that's fine. We're considering each other as ends in themselves. Obviously, there's an interesting link to Jesus' golden rule: do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. It's more, of course, the other way round. It's more do as you would have everybody else do. And again, you could link it to Sartre, but I'm not going to go into that now. The third formulation, then, the so-called kingdom of ends, is to act as if by your maxim you are a legislator in the kingdom of ends. This returns us to this idea of autonomy. So you are deciding for yourself what ought to be done, and it is not for other people to decide what they should. So it is for other people to decide what they should do. It is not for you to decide what other people should do, as in, if someone does something immoral, that is completely on them. They're their own moral agents. You just sort out your own self. So again, this should be fairly liberating, but obviously it feeds into his wider metaphysics about God and the world to come. So he does think at the moment it's a shame, not everybody is acting morally. It would be better if they did, but at the moment they don't. So we have to postulate a world that is future to us, in which people will behave in complete accord with the moral law. And on that note, it's worth noting the difference between a holy will and our will. So a holy will is one that's in complete accord with the moral law. This, of course, links to the Utifo dilemma. Kant is very explicit. He says, we will not hold God's commands to be obligatory because they are commanded by God, but rather we will hold them to be God's commands because we are internally obligated to them. So you can see which side of the dilemma he sits there. Now, on to some objections. The most obvious objection is that this is incredibly rigid and it's quite hard to apply to nuanced situations. The axe murderer we've already used as an example. Abortion, euthanasia, these all seem to be very, very rigid. But I would say don't confuse rigidity with a bad thing, because if the point of morality is to tell us what we should do, it might well be the case that there are some things that we should just never do. And if the answer is rigid and you don't like it, maybe you're just being immoral, would be the answer. On the other hand, I think he's also quite flexible for two reasons. Firstly, again, he's put us in charge, so the agent is in charge. Let's take the case of abortion. Now, I as a man can never have an abortion, so I can't say, I can't ever make a decision to not have an abortion or to have an abortion because I don't have a womb. And therefore, if you're talking about abortion and you're remembering the idea of the other people being their own autonomous agents, the maxim then becomes whether to advise someone against having an abortion or to advise someone to have an abortion, unless you are a woman, of course, in which case your maxim might be I will or I will not have an abortion. And quite frankly, it's probably going to be quite difficult to pass a maxim of the kind I will have an abortion, because you would then be willing against your own self to be alive, to be able to pass the maxim in the first place. If everybody had abortions, you could do some work trying to say, well, maybe a fetus doesn't have humanity in it. Maybe it is not susceptible, therefore, to the second formulation of the categorical imperative. I'm not going to get into that particular issue, but you see where the fun of talking about that would go. So be a bit more imaginative. And that leads me on to this second thing. Go back to the axe murderer. There's nothing un-Kantian about saying, do you know what, Mr. Axe Murderer or Mr. Axe Murderer, probably you haven't had a cup of tea for a while. The kettle's just boiled. Come in. Also, probably if you read some Dylan Thomas yourself and even some Kant, you'd probably find you didn't want to go about murdering people, would you? So, in other words, you just need to think harder a bit. And that's the thing about the conflicting maxims. So, you only have conflicting duties if you're trying to prescribe a maxim or pass a maxim through the categorical imperative that is immoral. No. Start again. Think harder. You might say, well, my duty to protect my mother or my country. So go back to Sartre's student who comes to him, should I go to war or not? It depends what your maxim is. You could have a maxim of, I will protect my country, in which case you could potentially go to war. You could, of course, have the maxim, I must look after, honour my parents, and that also would be quite a good maxim to pass. It will depend on what your proposed maxim and thus proposed course of action might be. Taking that particular case, you could, of course, use Kant's essay on perpetual peace. This is really, really very interesting because in saying that we should get rid of standing armies, so you're not allowed to pay people to fight for your country because that's using them as means to an end, but you may defend your country as a volunteer when under attack. Well, of course, the thing there is that if you're under attack, and so you're allowed to defend yourself, you're only going to be under attack. You're not going to be under attack, are you? Because all the countries in this scenario for perpetual peace are only ever going to volunteer, have a militia that volunteers when it's under attack. So there won't be anyone doing any attacking, so it will be fine. So in practice, or the logical consequence of this, if everybody were to do it, is that you wouldn't actually have anybody fighting ever, and thus you would have a perpetual peace. So you could say on this thing, if in the Sartre's case the country is being attacked, you could volunteer. But if it's not, if you are being an aggressor, then it's not. So anyway, there is, what I'm trying to say is there is this flexibility, there is this autonomy that is still at the absolute heart of his ethical system. And I think, therefore, it really is quite liberating. In terms of whether it can apply to modern times, this is generally, again, because of the idea of duty. Duty seems to be a dirty word. Another thing people say is, yes, but you can't help but think of the consequences. It's natural to think of the consequences. Well, so what? Think harder. You are rational. Figure it out. Stop thinking about the consequences. Think only of the logical consequences, not the practical consequences. Stop being blinded by 19th century utilitarianism. On the other hand, you could say a bit with a bit more force, I think, that Kant does have a fairly high sense of people's rational capabilities. And what do you do if you are a child or you are mentally incapacitated? You can't maybe apply reason. Well, no. But then you're not morally responsible. So you sort of get off the hook, if you like, and just think about the criminal age of responsibility in the UK being 10. Think about how criminals who are mentally ill might have a defence of mental incapacity or diminished responsibility. So there's a precedent in law for that. You do remember that Kant said that reading Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber, and that Hume said that morality, Hume said that reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. So you could say, yeah, as much as we try, we aren't just purely rational beings, and we shouldn't be. But remember that, of course, morality and ethics doesn't describe the world, doesn't describe human beings as they are. It describes the world and human beings as it and they should be. And that is why, ultimately, I would say it is an entirely excellent principle to live by, even if sometimes you try, but you just can't. Thanks for listening.